There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in very old, very expensive houses. The silence of a man who has made sure no one gets close enough to disturb it. Walter Ashworth Kane, 79 years old, founder of the largest private shipping line on the Georgia coast, was lying perfectly still on the floor of his study, eyes shut, breath shallow and slow. A gold pocket watch lay open beside his hand. An insulin pen lay a few inches from his fingers, uncapped, untouched. He was not sick. He was not unconscious. He was waiting to find out if a single soul left on Earth would kneel down and help a man everyone assumed didn't need it. What happened next, when a 9-year-old girl, who was never supposed to set foot in that house, walked through the door, would end with his lawyers reading a will that made 2 grown adults scream in a room full of strangers? Stay until the end, because the girl he tested that morning is not who you think she becomes. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I have come to believe that the wealthiest people are often the loneliest, not because no one wants to be near them, but because they have spent so long guarding against being used that they no longer know what it feels like to be simply liked. Walter Kane built that loneliness one contract at a time, and by the time he was 79, he had perfected it into something close to an art form. Walter Ashworth Kane owned 11 cargo vessels, a private terminal outside Savannah, Georgia, and a house on the Isle of Hope so large that 3 full-time staff could not keep every room dusted in a single week. Every morning, he ate the same breakfast at the same table at the same hour, alone, because he had long ago decided that routine was easier to trust than people. He had 2 grown children, a son in finance in Manhattan and a daughter who split her time between Palm Beach and wherever her husband's polo season took her. Neither had visited in 14 months. Walter no longer expected them to, and telling himself he no longer expected them to had become its own kind of comfort. That Tuesday, the Chatham County school system had closed for a teacher planning day, and Loretta Banks, who had cleaned and managed the Kane house for 6 years, had nowhere else to put her 9-year-old daughter, Nora. Loretta's husband, Desmond, a former Marine combat medic, had herniated 2 discs in his spine, hauling shipping pallets the year before, and had not worked since. There was no extra money for a sitter, and there had not been extra money for anything in longer than Loretta liked to admit. In the car that morning, she made Nora promise, 3 separate times, that she would stay in the sunroom, touch nothing, and never, under any circumstance, go near Mr. Kane's study. Nora promised all 3 times without complaint, the way children do when they have already decided the rule does not apply to them the moment something interesting happens. Loretta believed her anyway, because believing her daughter was easier than spending the whole drive worrying, and because some worries, once you let them in, do not leave for the rest of the day. What Loretta did not know was that her employer was, at that exact moment, lying on the floor of that study with his eyes shut, testing a theory he had carried for 40 years, that when people believe no one is watching and something valuable is within reach, their true nature always shows itself. He had done this before, quietly, with staff he suspected, with a nephew he no longer trusted, with a contractor who had once billed him for work never performed. He had never once been disappointed by how low people would go. He had laid a gold pocket watch open on the rug beside his hand, and an uncapped insulin pen a few inches from his fingers, and arranged his own body the way a man falls when his heart has decided the day is over. He fully expected today to be no different from any of the others. Nora lasted 11 minutes in the sunroom before her curiosity got the better of her, the way it does with any 9-year-old left alone in a house built for people 3 times her age. The sunroom had a piano no one played, and a wall of windows facing a garden more manicured than any yard she had ever stood in, and for a while, that was enough to hold her attention. Then it wasn't. She wandered down a hallway lined with oil paintings of ships she didn't recognize, huge dark canvases in gold frames, each one heavier, she guessed, than her entire bedroom furniture put together. She counted 12 closed doors before she found one standing open, just wide enough to see a man lying on the rug beside an overturned chair, one arm flung out, perfectly still. She did not think about money. She did not think about jobs or rules or her mother's warnings, all of which had seemed very important in the car and suddenly seemed very far away. She thought about her father, who had once shown her, sitting on their back porch on a Sunday afternoon, exactly where to press 2 fingers to feel if someone's heart was still working, because, he told her, you never know when you'll be the only one in the room who does. Nora knelt down beside a stranger 3 times her size and pressed her fingers to his neck, exactly the way Desmond had taught her, and held her breath, counting. I want to sit with this moment for a second, because it is easy to rush past it toward the reveal. A 9-year-old girl, told explicitly not to enter that room, chose to break a direct instruction from the one person whose job depended on her obedience, because she believed a stranger's life mattered more than a rule. That is not a small thing. Most adults, faced with the same choice between keeping their job and helping someone, hesitate long enough to think about the consequences first. Nora did not hesitate at all, and I don't think it occurred to her that hesitation was even an option. Walter felt the 2 small fingers against his neck and very nearly broke character on the spot. This was not part of any test he had designed. He had expected someone to eye the pocket watch, maybe the insulin pen, maybe simply back out of the room and pretend they'd seen nothing at all, the way most staff would, not wanting to be the one who found him and had to explain it. He had not accounted for a child checking whether he was alive, methodically, seriously, the way a much older person might. Nora's count reached 10, and she did not like what she felt, faint, uneven, so she did exactly what her father had trained her to do. She stood up to run for her mother. And that was the moment Walter understood that in about 4 seconds, a 9-year-old girl was going to bring the housekeeper, and possibly an ambulance, into a lie he had constructed for his own curiosity, and there would be no elegant way to explain any of it afterward. Wait, Walter whispered, eyes still shut, voice deliberately weak. I'm all right, sweetheart. Just resting. Nora stopped at the doorway. She did not look convinced. Resting people don't fall out of chairs, she said. My daddy fell once, from his back, and everybody said he was resting too, and it was bad. I'm getting my mum. There is a particular kind of fear that only shows up when a lie is about to cost more than you meant it to. Walter opened his eyes. He was not shaking from any real illness. He was shaking because a child had just seen through 79 years of practiced control in under a minute, and because some part of him, long buried, was ashamed of what he'd been about to let happen. A house full of people mobilized in panic over nothing, all so he could satisfy his own curiosity about whether a poor family's daughter would take a pocket watch. I wasn't resting, he admitted, sitting up slowly, his joints protesting the movement in a way that was not part of the act. I was pretending. I wanted to see what you would do if you thought no one was watching and there was something valuable right beside me. He gestured at the watch. Nora looked at it, then back at him, her face somewhere between confused and insulted. You wanted to see if I'd steal it, she said flatly. I thought you were dying. I wasn't thinking about your watch at all. I wasn't even really looking at it until you just pointed at it. I think this is the line that should stop us, because it exposes exactly what was wrong with the test itself. Walter had built an experiment to measure greed, and what walked through the door instead was a child whose only instinct was mercy. He had spent so many years looking for the worst in people that he had forgotten most people are not thinking about what they can take from a crisis. They are thinking about whether the person in front of them is going to be okay, and it had been so long since anyone had looked at Walter that way that he had genuinely forgotten it was possible. He asked her name, mostly to have something to say, while he decided what to do with the rest of the morning. Nora Banks, she told him. My mom is Loretta. She cleans your house. I'm not supposed to be back here. She's going to be so mad. Walter said nothing for a moment, turning the pocket watch over once in his hand out of habit, and then told her that whatever trouble she thought she was in, she had earned exactly the opposite that morning, though he did not yet know how to say what he meant by that. Walter, unsettled and unwilling to let the moment go, pressed further, the way men who have run companies for 50 years press when they sense they haven't gotten to the real answer yet. What if I told you, he said, that I'll give you this watch, right now, and you never mention any of this to your mother? Not the pretending, not what you saw. Just take it and go back to the sunroom And we forget this happened. It was a cheap trick, and Walter knew it the moment the words left his mouth. He wanted to know if the girl who hadn't taken the bait of a pretend crisis would take the bait of a direct bribe for silence, because in his experience, everyone had a price, even the honest ones. It just took longer to find theirs. Nora considered it for exactly as long as it takes a child to consider something she finds strange rather than tempting, which was not very long at all. "I don't want your watch," she said. "I want you to see an actual doctor. My daddy pretends he's fine too, and he isn't. And one day pretending is going to catch up to somebody in this family. And I don't want it to be you, since you're the only reason my mum still has a job." Walter sat completely still. In 4 sentences, a 9-year-old had refused a bribe, diagnosed his loneliness, and revealed that she understood, more clearly than his own children ever had, exactly how much her family's survival depended on his goodwill. And she had used that leverage not to ask him for anything, but to worry about his health instead. He had built companies on negotiating leverage his entire life, and he had never once seen anyone use it the way she just had. He thought, without meaning to, of his mother, Ruth Kane, and the thought arrived with the particular force of a memory that has been waiting 31 years for permission to surface. I want to tell you about a different Thursday now, because you cannot understand the man on that rug without understanding the man he was at 48, standing in a hospital corridor in Charleston with a phone against his ear and a decision he did not yet know he had already made. Ruth Kane had been sick for the better part of a year by then, and the doctors had stopped using the word recovery sometime in February. She asked her son for exactly one thing in those last months. Not money, not attention every day, just this, that he come home from the shipping yard before dark, once a week, and sit with her, even if neither of them said much. Walter told her he would, after the current contract closed, and he believed himself when he said it. The way people often believe the promises that are easiest to break, there was always a next contract. That particular one was a shipping rights negotiation in Charleston that had dragged on for weeks, and on the Thursday it finally closed. Walter was in a boardroom shaking hands when a call came through from the hospital that he let go to voicemail, because you did not step out of a room like that one, not for anything, he had told himself for years. By the time he listened to the message in the elevator afterward, his mother had already been gone for 40 minutes. He drove through the night to get back to Savannah anyway, for reasons he never fully explained to anyone, and sat alone in a hospital room that had already been cleaned for the next patient, holding a coat that still smelled faintly of her, and made himself a promise that he kept far better than the one he had broken, that he would never again let anyone see exactly how much that Thursday still cost him. 31 years later, a 9-year-old girl he had known for 11 minutes had just come closer to understanding him than anyone had since. Nora reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small brass compass, scratched and missing its glass face, the needle sticking slightly when it turned. "This was my grandpa's," she said. "He carried it in Vietnam. My daddy gave it to me for my birthday and told me it always finds north, even when you're lost, and I want you to have it, because you seem like somebody who forgot which way home is." She held it out to him, not dramatically, the way a child hands over something because it seems like the right thing to do, and not because she understands the weight of the gesture. Walter took it in his palm and said nothing for a long time, because there are moments when a man's throat closes, and no amount of money in the world can open it back up. I want to be honest about why this moment matters more than the watch he tried to give away. Walter offered Nora an object worth thousands of dollars to buy her silence, and she refused it without a second thought. Nora offered Walter an object that could not be appraised by anyone, a keepsake tied to her father's history, freely, because she believed he needed it more than she did. That is the entire difference, in one exchange, between what money can purchase and what it never will. "I can't take this," Walter finally said. "It's yours." Nora shrugged. "You can give it back when you're not lost anymore," she said, and walked out to find her mother, leaving a 9-year-old's compass in the open palm of one of the wealthiest men in the state of Georgia, who sat there, holding it for a long while after she had gone, in a room that suddenly felt less like a stage than it had in 20 years. Loretta arrived moments later, breathless, certain she was about to be fired, certain her daughter had ruined the only stable income keeping their family afloat while Desmond recovered. She had run the length of the house at a pace she had not managed since her 20s, rehearsing an apology the entire way, none of which she got the chance to deliver. Walter met her at the study door, still holding the compass. "Your daughter didn't do anything wrong," he said, before she could get a single word out. "I did. I staged all of it, and she was the only person who saw straight through me and still tried to save my life, instead of judging me for the lie." Loretta stood in the doorway, one hand still on the frame, trying to understand what kind of morning she had actually walked into. He told Loretta what he rarely told anyone directly, that he had a tremor in his left hand that had started 8 months ago, that he had not seen a doctor because a diagnosis would force him to hand control of Kane Maritime to a board he did not trust, and that this morning's staged collapse had, without his intending it, become the closest thing to an honest conversation about his health that he'd had in years. Loretta listened without interrupting, the way people learn to listen when their livelihood depends on understanding exactly what is being asked of them. Then he made an offer that had nothing to do with charity, and everything to do with debt he suddenly understood he owed. He would pay for Desmond's spinal surgery outright, the one Loretta had told him, months earlier, they could not afford on their own. He would set up a trust for Nora's education through college. And in exchange, he asked only one thing, that Nora be allowed to visit the house after school, not to work, but simply to sit with him in the study some afternoons, because, and this was the part that cost him the most to say out loud, he had not had anyone ask about his health in longer than he could remember, and he did not want to lose that so soon after finding it. Loretta did not answer right away. She had spent 6 years learning exactly how far to trust the man in front of her, and this offer sat well past the edge of anything she had ever had reason to expect from him. She told him she would think about it, and she did think about it, the entire drive home, out loud with Desmond that evening at their kitchen table, turning the offer over from every angle a person learns to check when a stranger's generosity seems too large for the moment that produced it. In the end, it was Nora who settled it, saying simply that Mr. Kane wasn't scary, he was just sad, and sad people needed somebody to sit with them the same way sick people did. Desmond Banks did not want to hear a word of it at first. He had spent 2 years managing pain with over-the-counter medication and a level of stubbornness Loretta had stopped trying to talk him out of, telling himself that a man who had served 2 tours without complaint could manage a bad back without anyone's charity. Accepting help from his wife's employer felt, to him, like a debt he would never be able to repay in a currency that meant anything. It was Nora, again, who found the argument that worked, telling her father over dinner that Mr. Kane wasn't paying for the surgery to be nice. He was paying for it because keeping quiet about being in pain had already cost one person in this story 31 years, and she didn't want it to cost her father the same thing. Desmond set down his fork and did not have a response ready for that, which was, by itself, a kind of answer. The surgery took place that winter at a hospital outside Savannah, a 2-level discectomy the surgeon described as more routine than it felt to the family sitting in the waiting room. Walter did not come to the hospital himself, understanding, correctly, that his presence would turn a private fear into a public performance. Instead, he sent a card, no return address printed on it, that read only, "Some debts are better paid quietly, get well, and see you on the other side of it," and Loretta kept that card in a kitchen drawer for the rest of her life. By spring, Desmond was walking without the cane he had needed for a year, and within 6 months, he had returned to work, not hauling pallets this time, but training new hires on load safety at the terminal, a job Walter created and never once described using the word charity. Desmond took it anyway, understanding by then that some gifts are not about the money at all, but about being trusted enough to be given real work instead of a check that asks nothing of you in return. Nora came to the Kane house 3 afternoons a week after that, did her homework at the desk across from Walter's, and argued with him constantly about whether his shipping company should be doing more to clean up the harbor pollution his own vessels had contributed to for decades. An argument Walter, to his own surprise, began to enjoy losing more than he had ever enjoyed winning a negotiation. The compass sat on his desk the entire time, repaired that spring by Mr. Talbot, a jeweler on Bull Street who fitted it with a new glass face and, at Walter's request, engraved a single line on the underside, "For the one who found me before I was lost." Walter told anyone who asked that it was a gift from a business associate. It was, in every sense that mattered, the truest gift he had ever received, and he kept it within arm's reach on his desk for the rest of his life. There were harder afternoons too, the kind that don't make it into the version of a story people like to remember. There was a stretch when Nora was 12 and furious that her school could not afford new library books while the Kane house had an entire wing no one used, and she said so to Walter's face, expecting him to be offended. Instead, he wrote a check to the school district that same week and told her that being told the truth by someone who wasn't afraid of him was worth more to him than the silence everyone else in his life had been giving him for years. There was a Christmas when Walter, without asking anyone, arranged for a small trust to cover the mortgage on the bank's family home outright. Not as a gift, he announced, but as a fact Loretta discovered from her own bank 2 weeks later, and when she confronted him about it, upset that he hadn't asked first, he told her he had learned, from her daughter, that some kindnesses lose their meaning the moment you wait for permission to give them. By the time Nora was 14, she had stopped thinking of the house on the Isle of Hope as somewhere she visited and started thinking of it as somewhere she simply belonged some afternoons. In the particular, unremarkable way, a person belongs somewhere without ever having decided to. I think it is worth pausing here to talk about Marcus and Vivian, not because they were monsters, but because their absence during these years is its own kind of story, one that was unfolding at the exact same time as everything I've just described, in apartments and vacation houses hundreds of miles from Savannah. Marcus called his father on his birthday most years, a conversation that rarely lasted past 4 minutes and almost always turned, by the second minute, to a question about how the company's stock performance might affect a trust distribution he was counting on for a renovation or a school tuition payment. He was not unkind exactly. He simply did not think to ask questions that weren't, in some form, about money, because no one had ever modeled a different kind of question for him growing up. Vivian visited twice in the years Nora was growing up, both times for less than a day, both times because she needed her father's signature on something related to a trust her husband's family had structured around Kane stock. On her second visit, she noticed a child's handwriting on a homework page left out on Walter's desk and asked, without much curiosity, whose it was. Walter told her the truth, that it belonged to the housekeeper's daughter, who came by most afternoons. Vivian said only that it was nice he had company and left within the hour, and never asked another question about it. I don't think either of them ever noticed the compass on his desk. I don't think they would have known to ask about it if they had. That is not, in itself, a crime. But it is the reason that when the moment came for Walter to decide who had actually shown up for him, the answer had already been written for years, quietly, in 100 ordinary afternoons neither of his children had been present for. When Nora turned 16, a classmate named Priya Chen, who ran the investigative section of their high school paper, brought her a set of internal memos an anonymous source inside Kane Maritime had leaked. Memos suggesting the company had known about harbor contamination from its own fuel runoff for decades, and had quietly settled complaints rather than address the cause. Priya did not know about Nora's relationship with Walter Kane when she asked for her help. Nora did not tell her. For almost 2 weeks, Nora carried those documents without showing them to anyone, turning over, again and again, the same argument she and Walter had been having across that desk for years: the harbor, the vessels, the pollution he had always defended as an industry-wide problem, rather than a company-specific failure. Now she was holding proof that at least part of it had been his failure specifically, known and managed rather than fixed. She did not go to Priya with an answer. She did not go to a lawyer or a reporter either. Instead, she drove herself to the Isle of Hope on a Saturday she was not normally scheduled to visit, sat down across from Walter at the same desk where she had done algebra homework for years, and placed the documents in front of him without a word of introduction. "Are you going to keep pretending about this too?" she asked, once he had read enough to understand what he was looking at. It was the same accusation, in different words, that she had made to him 7 years earlier over a fake collapse and a real diagnosis he hadn't wanted to face. Walter looked at the papers for a long time, long enough that Nora began to wonder if she had just ended the only real friendship either of them had left. Then he picked up the phone and called his general counsel, right there in front of her, to begin remediation and public disclosure before any story could break on its own terms. He did not do it because Nora threatened him. He did it because she had, once again, simply refused to let him keep pretending. And by then, he had spent enough years around her to know that pretending in front of Nora Banks never lasted very long anyway. The disclosure cost Kane Maritime a difficult quarter and cost Walter a hard, public admission that the company he had built had cut corners he was responsible for. It also became, quietly, the thing he was proudest of in his final years, not because it was easy, but because it was the first time in his adult life he had told an uncomfortable truth before someone forced it out of him. Walter's biological children heard about the harbor disclosure from a business headline, not from their father, and called only to ask how it would affect the value of shares they had never worked a single day to earn. His son Marcus wanted to know if the family's dividend would be affected that quarter. His daughter Vivian wanted to know if the story would follow her socially into circles that read the business pages more closely than she did. Neither asked whether their father was well, or how he had come to make the decision, or what it had cost him. I think it would be easy to make Marcus and Vivian into simple villains here, and it would also be dishonest. Walter had raised them the way he ran his company, by results, not by presence, and it should not surprise anyone that two children raised to measure worth in numbers grew up asking about numbers first. The tragedy is not that they were cruel, it is that their father taught them, without meaning to, that love was something you earned through performance, the same lesson he had spent years unlearning with a housekeeper's daughter who owed him nothing and gave him everything anyway. Walter's health did decline after that, slowly and then quickly. The tremor eventually joined by a heart condition Dr. Rebecca Hale told him had likely been present, untreated, for years, before that staged collapse in his study finally forced him to get checked at all. He lived another 11 years past that morning on the rug, years he would later say were worth more to him than the 68 that came before them combined, though he was careful never to say that within earshot of Marcus or Vivian, not wanting to hand either of them one more reason to resent a girl who had never once asked to be compared to them. In his final years, Walter walked Nora, by then a college graduate with a business degree she had earned, without ever once mentioning whose desk she'd done her homework at as a child, through the entire operation of Kane Maritime, department by department, insisting she understand every ship, every contract, every worker's name, before she ever set foot in a boardroom as anything other than a guest. He took her down to the terminal on mornings when his hands shook too badly to sign his own name without help, introduced her to dock workers he had employed for decades, men and women whose children's names he somehow still remembered, and told her, more than once, that a company was not its balance sheet, it was every family whose kitchen table depended on decisions made in rooms those families were never invited into. There was one afternoon, not long before the end, when Walter took the compass off his desk, turned it over in his hands the way he had the very first day, and told Nora that he had spent the first 79 years of his life believing that trust was a weakness to be tested out of people, and the last 11 learning that it was the only thing worth building anything on top of. He did not frame it as advice, he framed it as an apology, though he never said the word directly, for every year he had spent testing people instead of simply believing them. Nora asked him, that same afternoon, whether he had ever told Marcus or Vivian any of this. Walter was quiet for a while before answering that he had tried, more than once, and that trying, at his age, mostly meant leaving voicemails that were never returned. He did not sound bitter when he said it. He sounded like a man who had made peace with an outcome, without pretending it didn't still ache somewhere underneath the peace. Walter Ashworth Kane died in his sleep on a spring evening, in the same study, in the same chair, with the harbour visible through the window and the compass resting closed in his hand. Mrs. Marsh, who had managed the house's daily affairs in Loretta's later years, after Loretta moved into overseeing the family foundation full-time, found him the next morning and said afterward that his face looked more at rest than she had ever seen it, even in sleep. Nora had spoken to him the night before, A short phone call about nothing important, a jeweler's invoice, a shareholder meeting scheduled for the following week, the kind of ordinary conversation that only reveals its weight after it becomes the last one. Before hanging up, Walter told her, almost as an afterthought, that he had left instructions with Rosalind Hart, and that she should not be surprised by anything the will said, because none of it would be new information to anyone who had actually been paying attention for the last 11 years. I think there are some endings that need no loud drama to earn their weight. Walter Kane did not die testing anyone. He died holding the one object in his possession that had never once been part of a test, given to him freely by a child who had nothing to gain from giving it. And it seems fitting, in a story that began with a staged collapse, that his real death was the opposite of theatre entirely, quiet, unremarkable, and entirely his own. The reading of his will took place 2 weeks later in a conference room at Rosalind Hart's office in downtown Savannah, and it was, by every account, considerably less peaceful than his final evening had been. Marcus flew in from Manhattan the night before. Vivian arrived from Palm Beach, already dressed for a lunch she had scheduled for immediately afterward, having assumed, reasonably enough given how these things usually went in families like hers, that the whole matter would take under an hour. Attorney Hart read the trust distributions first, sizable, more than either Marcus or Vivian would ever need, exactly as their father had promised years earlier when he told them, not unkindly, that he had already given them everything he thought money alone could give a person. Both looked satisfied, Vivian checking her watch, Marcus already composing a reply to an email on his phone, the way people do when they believe a meeting is essentially over even before it is. "There is one more matter," Attorney Hart said, and the room went still, in the particular way rooms go still when someone's tone changes before their words do. She read the remaining clause aloud, controlling ownership of Kane Maritime Shipping, its terminal, and the Isle of Hope estate, left in full to Nora Elaine Banks, in recognition, the will stated, of the only person who ever tried to save his life, before she knew there was anything in it for her. Vivian stood up so fast, her chair scraped the floor loud enough that it was the only sound in the room for a full second afterward. "This is insane," she said. "She's the housekeeper's daughter. We are his children." Nora, sitting quietly near the back of the room in a chair she had chosen specifically because it wasn't at the table, said nothing at all, watching Vivian's anger the way a person watches weather they've already been warned was coming. It was Marcus, unexpectedly, who spoke next, his voice quieter than his sister's, almost too quiet for the far end of the table to catch clearly the first time. "He tried to call me last winter," he said. 3 times. I let it go to voicemail because I was in a meeting. I never called him back." He looked at Nora for a long moment. The first time in the entire reading he had looked directly at her, rather than at the papers in front of him. "I think he already knew the answer before he wrote this," he said. "I think we gave it to him a long time ago, and none of us were paying close enough attention to notice we'd done it." Attorney Hart placed a small sealed envelope on the table, addressed to Marcus and Vivian together, from their father. Neither read it aloud in the room. Vivian left within the hour, still furious, her lunch appointment forgotten, and did not speak to Nora again for nearly 2 years. Marcus stayed behind, alone, long after everyone else had gone, and read the letter twice before folding it back into his coat pocket without telling anyone what it said. I think what happened to Marcus in that room matters, because most stories like this one are satisfied to leave the entitled children exactly as bitter as they started. Marcus did not become a different man overnight, and I would not want to promise you he did, because that would be a tidier ending than the truth deserves. But 6 months later, he began showing up, quietly. At company shareholder meetings Nora ran, asking real questions, instead of only asking about dividends, sitting in the back, the way Nora once had at a table that used to belong to someone else entirely. It was not forgiveness exactly, not yet, and Nora never pretended it was. It was the first small, uncertain step of a man beginning, very late, to wonder what his father had actually been trying to teach him all along, and Nora decided, for her own reasons, that a small, uncertain step deserved more patience than an old grudge would have given it. Nora did not sell Kane Maritime, and she did not disappear into the life the inheritance could have bought her. She restructured half the company's charitable foundation into what she named the Compass House Initiative, funding spinal surgeries and job retraining for injured veterans like her father, and full college trusts for the children of the company's own maintenance and dockworker staff. The people whose names, she made sure, the payroll system would never again treat as interchangeable line items. Loretta stayed on for another 2 years after Walter's death, not out of necessity, but because she had spent so long caring for that house that leaving it all at once felt like leaving a part of her own family behind. When she finally did retire, Nora made sure the transition was gentle, and made sure, too, that the woman who had once feared losing everything over 11 unsupervised minutes would never again have to wonder whether her family's stability depended on someone else's goodwill. The compass itself now sits behind glass in the lobby of the Kane Maritime headquarters, its engraving visible to anyone who stops to read it, for the one who found me before I was lost. Beneath it, a second, smaller plate was added years later, in Nora's own handwriting, cast in brass to match. He found his way back, and then he helped the rest of us find ours. On a Tuesday years later, during a Chatham County Teacher Planning Day, a 9-year-old girl sat in the Kane Maritime lobby, waiting for her mother's shift to end, staring at the glass case with the compass inside it. The way children stare at things they don't yet understand, but sense are important anyway. Nora, now the company's CEO, happened to walk through and sat down on the bench beside her, in no particular hurry. "Do you know whose that was?" Nora asked. The girl shook her head. "It belonged to a man who spent most of his life afraid to trust anyone," Nora said, "until somebody about your age decided to trust him first, even when she had every reason not to." The girl studied the compass a moment longer, tilting her head slightly. "Did it work?" she asked. "Did it help him find his way?" Nora smiled, the same way Walter used to when a hard question landed somewhere true. "It's still working," she said. "That's the whole point of a compass. It doesn't stop just because somebody found north once." The girl seemed to accept this answer completely, the way children accept the things adults say with certainty, and went back to swinging her feet against the bench, waiting for her mother, unaware that she was sitting exactly where a story very much like her own had once begun. I don't want to end this with a lesson stated too neatly, because the truth Walter Kane learned was never simple, and it did not arrive all at once, and it cost him more than one Thursday in March to get there. But if there is one image worth keeping, it is this. A man who spent decades testing the world for its worst finally met someone who, without knowing it, was testing him right back, for whether he was still capable of being helped at all. He was, and the help he received from a child who owed him nothing became, in the end, the only inheritance he ever gave that no one could contest, sell, or take away from anyone.